Major Dan Gade, who, by the way, I just found out is going to be promoted to Lieutenant Colonel Dan Gade within days. I tell you quite sincerely, he may literally be the best qualified person in the country to address you today on this topic. He's kind of walking, talking trifecta of expertise. First of all, Dan is an exemplary soldier. He was a platoon and a company commander, including combat in Iraq, where he was awarded 2 Purple Hearts and decorated for valor. Currently, he's an assistant professor at West Point, where I've actually seen him in action as a really superb instructor of young men and women headed into the Army. So that's his kind of first piece of expertise. His second piece of expertise is that he is an authority on social policy, and particularly an expert on disability. He earned a PhD in public administration and policy, and then he went on to serve in the White House as a presidential aide, where I had the privilege to work with him, among other projects, on the Bill Shalala Commission. Some of you will remember from several years ago, where he did some really helpful landmark work to help us begin to modernize the definition of disability and what it means to be disabled today. And the third expertise that Dan brings this afternoon is that he's not just an academic observer. The second time that he was wounded in Iraq, his injuries were exceptionally severe. Last I was counting, I think he's had more than 40 operations as part of his recovery process. And by recovery, what I mean is going on to become a champion triathlete over the last few years, among many other accomplishments. And Dan had done all of those things, I can tell you, as a personal note, with the kind of the warmest and bravest and least complaining disposition you will ever come across, and also very funny. For example, it was actually the president who pinned Dan with his 2 Purple Hearts while he was in Walter Reed, and the president presented his first Purple Heart and then started to go to the next bed, as you do, and the military aide called him back. Got 2 right here, so I'm sure raised his eyebrows or something, and at which point I'm told Dan looked right at the president and without missing a beat said, "I make an excellent target, sir." Probably the time when he didn't feel like being very cheerful, so I was impressed that under those sort of circumstances he can still find a sense of humor. Anyway, I think he'll also be an excellent contributor to this meeting, so really welcome again, please.
Thank you. It's a thrill to be here. You can just go ahead and keep eating. I'm going to say some things today that are controversial, and I want you to push back on me if I need pushback. I'm completely open to that. My cadets in my political science class are sometimes afraid of me, and so they're afraid to push back. But I know this audience won't be. So feel free. I'm happy to field your comments and critiques. So it's funny that Carl and Thomas titled this "A Cautionary Tale from a Wounded Warrior." I have a different title for it. For those of you who can't read in the back, or can't read at this distance. We can't hear right here.
Closer to the mic.
I know you know how to read, but at this distance it might be hard. But my subtitle is "How Perverse Incentives Cripple Veterans." And I'm using these strong words on purpose because I believe that that's part of what's going on in our society right now. And I'm gonna flesh that out a little bit more. But first, so Carl and Thomas called this a cautionary tale from a wounded warrior, and I'm reminded of a photo that's on the internet entitled "Mistakes." It could be that the purpose of your life is only to serve as a warning to others. So I guess this is what Carl thinks of me. So before we dive in here, I want to talk real briefly about the difference between the normative and the positive. So as we're thinking about big ideas, the normative is the way things ought to be, and the positive is the way things are. So much of the morning we've heard from people who are out there changing their communities, and they are largely speaking in positive terms. And I'm going to take a step back right now and talk in normative terms about what a healthy veterans policy and what a healthy view of society towards veterans looks like. So first we need to decide what we mean when we think of disability. And there's 2 real ways that disability is thought of. One is called the medical model. The medical model is based largely, I'm sad to say, in paternalism. In this idea that you're disabled, woe is you, here's some money to make ourselves feel better. That's a paternalistic attitude towards people with disability. Furthermore, it assumes, the medical model assumes that by getting a diagnosis of a condition, that you are therefore disabled, and it assumes an inability to work or to participate in other important social functions. So volunteering at your nonprofit, going to worship at your house of worship, etc. So this idea of disability as being a condition is the root of the medical model of disability. And I'm sad to say that most of our federal disability policy is based around a medical model because it's enshrined in law. And then it's layered over and layered over and layered over with years and years and years of regulation. But at the end of the day, the medical model is the basis for Social Security disability insurance, and I'm sorry to say, for VA disability compensation. But this is an obsolete view of disability. And in order to illustrate that, I want to give you two examples. One is a cousin of mine. I have a cousin who has such a bad case of dyslexia. She has a horrible case of dyslexia, diagnosis. She literally will be driving down the highway and can't read what the exit signs say. She doesn't know what exit she is coming up on because it might say Rosalind, and she can't read that word. It's all jumbled up to her. In the medical model of disability, she's disabled, and they would have shuffled her off to some learning disabled school, and she would have been disabled forever. In the real world, however, she's just finishing up her PhD actually in public policy, and that's she's able to do that because of the other supports that she's gotten. So a medical diagnosis of disability is insufficient. And then in my paper, which is the opening chapter of the book, I in an earlier draft, I had a story about the South African sprinter Oscar Pistorius, who is a bilateral baloney amputee, and guaranteed he's faster than everybody in this room unless you're driving, he's running. He's a little slower now that he's in jail. But that is somebody who, under the medical definition of disability, would be disabled. But fortunately, there's a newer and a more modern way of thinking about disability. And we call that the social model. The social model says, yeah, okay, we all have medical conditions, right? Some of us are older, some of us are younger, some of us are maimed, some of us aren't. But a medical condition is just a starting point, and as a matter of fact, the condition itself may not be the biggest component of disability, because there's a social response, there's how people treat you because of your disability. There's a personal response, how do you treat the rest of the world because of however you view yourself. And then there can be barriers. In the built environment is a classic example of barriers. So if you think about a wheelchair user, they may not be, a person who uses a wheelchair may or may not be disabled in the sense of unable to provide work. If they're a computer technician or a school teacher or something like that, their disability is not based on their ability to work, it's based on their ability to get to work. So the built environment, so curbs. We step over curbs, a wheelchair user has to figure out a way to get over a curb or around a curb, and that's where the built environment can cause disability. So it's a diagnosis, yes, but it's also a diagnosis that's married with some other issues that cause it to be a disability. And it can only be assessed by a holistic view of the individual. So if you look at that person, some people who are wheelchair users are disabled in the social model, and some are not. But it's not based on the wheelchair, it's based on the rest of these things. And the goal of a healthy disability policy is to decrease the delta, the difference, between what somebody could have been, minus the condition, and what somebody is now. So for my wheelchair user, the way to reduce the delta is to give them an excellent wheelchair and to reduce the built environment to where there's curb cuts and parking spaces and all of that. So that's a pretty easy example of how a disability under the social model is viewed differently than under the medical model. So the goals of disability policy are several. First, obviously, maximum economic and social self-sufficiency. Not maximum income, not maximum provision of services, but maximum self-sufficiency. And it has these characteristics: adequacy, efficacy, simplicity. Efficacy I want to dwell on for a moment, because that's this idea that when we're designing a social policy, when we're designing policy, we need to very carefully consider whether we're treating the people that need to be treated, or we're providing services for the people that need to have services, and whether we're able to say no to the people who don't have to have services. So you have to be able to say yes to some and no to others. You can't just use a cookie cutter type approach. That's this idea of efficacy. And simplicity. We talked earlier about 40,000 or some organizations that claim to serve veterans. Obviously, we have a simplicity problem in our veterans policy. And it minimizes barriers. The two kinds of barriers that I talk about in this paper are headwinds and handicaps. The handicaps themselves are the condition, and the headwinds are the social response to the condition. Most importantly, we cannot, in a healthy social policy, create perverse incentives. We can't create the kind of incentives that cause undesirable behavior. And then finally, justice. Particularly when we're talking about veterans policy. There's this idea that somebody who has served and sacrificed blood and bone and muscle for their country is owed some kind of recognition for that service. And I understand that and I accept it and I embrace it, but we need to be careful about playing the justice card. We need to think very, very carefully about this term justice and what justice really means. We already went through that. I thought these were going out. Okay, so, all right, so here's some of the headwinds that face veterans. The biggest one relies on us having a very basic understanding of labor economics. And so now I'm going to take you back to your undergraduate economics class just for 2 slides. I promise it will be quick. If your mother gives you a bunch of money, or if you win a lottery that pays out on a monthly basis, or if the VA gives you disability payments that recur on a monthly basis, what that does is replaces your need to supply labor to the labor force. If enough income is replaced by transfer payments of any kind, it's totally secular about which direction the payments come from. If the transfer payments replace enough income, the person will exit the labor force. This is labor economics 101. And it's particularly true for those with weak attachment to the labor force. So we think of people with relatively poor education, high school, diploma, GED, and some disability. So those folks have a weaker attachment to the labor force and are more likely to exit the labor force if we replace their income from some other stream. Okay, here's a budget constraint. This is taking some of you guys back. Instead of thinking about consumption per month on the vertical axis and leisure per month on the horizontal axis, I want you to imagine a bear. On the vertical axis, the bear would like to consume blueberry muffins. On the horizontal axis, the bear would like to take naps. But the bear is constrained by the fact that there are only 24 hours in a day, and the bear can only consume 24 hours worth of blueberry muffins, or he can consume 24 hours worth of naps. And ultimately, the bear, like any other rational consumer, is going to decide what mix of blueberries and naps he wants. Okay? Very basic. Well, guess what? People are like bears. Now imagine we take our bear and we give him 4 extra hours in a day. So instead of a 24-hour day, the bear now faces a 28-hour day. Here's what happens. The budget constraint in terms of his time is shifted outward, parallel to the previous one. And he consumes now more naps and more blueberry muffins because he has more time to do both. And guess what? We are all the bear, right? If somebody gives you a bunch of money, it shifts your curve outward and you consume both more leisure and more goods and services. Right? It's very basic labor economics. But we tell ourselves this lie that veterans don't respond to incentives. We say, oh no, they're too patriotic. Of course they're not going to reduce their labor supply if given a bunch of money. They really like working. Well, that's true in some cases. No question about it. But the truth is, veterans are like anybody else in our consumption of leisure and our consumption of goods and services. And so given the transfer payment, we will reduce our labor supply, and that's what this chart shows. So the bottom line of those 2 charts is this bottom bullet here, that if our governmental system was designed on purpose to cause veterans to exit the labor force, if it was designed to handicap veterans on purpose, it couldn't be any better designed than it is now. Let me digest that just for a second. If you wanted veterans to be unemployed, or to exit the labor force, or to retire early, or to say that they're sicker than they actually are, there's no better system than to pay them to say those things. And that's our system now, because it's based in this, again, back to the medical model of disability that says, yeah, we're paternalistic, we're just going to give you a bunch of money and assuage our guilty consciences. And so here's some examples. Here's some hard and fast examples of the kinds of headwinds that veterans face. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but each one of these is a significant flaw in the current system. And it's sort of fleshed out in the opening chapter of the book, which I guess will be on our tables when we get back. Hooray. But there's a couple of things on here that are really important. One of these things on here is the hero treatment. The hero treatment is this non-monetary transfer of things like concert tickets and getting to be on the field at the football game and flipping the coin, and all of that stuff treats these recovering veterans like they're heroes, and so they're unwilling, or in some senses just kind of scared about leaving that treatment setting and going back to their communities and getting on with their lives. So that's the hero treatment. And then the rest of these are all versions of a of a budget constraint shift, of giving the bear 4 extra hours. So why do we encourage work? So, there's this idea that, well, these folks shouldn't have to work. These guys with disabilities, with amputations and this and that, they shouldn't have to work. But work has all kinds of positive effects. And I just want to highlight one of them. Most of you flew here, many of you flew here, or everybody in the room has probably flown in the last 45 days or so. And I want you to remember having a conversation with the person next to you in the seat on the flight to Denver or wherever. By the time you get to Denver, you know what they do for a living, you know if they're married or not, you know how many kids they have. And as you're taking your luggage out of the overhead compartment, what do you say? Anybody remember?
Nice to meet you.
You say, nice to meet you. What did you say your name was? Right? The reason is because our work, the first thing you told somebody, the first thing I tell somebody, oh, I'm a professional soldier, I'm a school teacher, there's all this big band, but they're all work related, right? The fact that my name is Dan Gade is irrelevant, really, to my identity. So we get identity through our work, and veterans are no different in that regard. Okay, so just keep that idea of the plane ride in your mind, and if it's not exactly true in your case, you can imagine that it's sort of true. We get our identity through our work. It does all these good things. It reduces health damaging behaviors and increases our ability to cope with stress and all of that stuff. And the bottom line here is it is a gateway to all kinds of meaningful social relationships. Now I have the bad news slide and I have a good news slide. The bad news slide is that none of this is going to change in the short term. Nothing is going to change in veterans policy that emanates from the federal government. There's probably not going to be a requirement that veterans who are claiming PTSD also have to attend focus groups and counseling sessions to help them cope with their symptoms. That's not going to happen. There's not going to be a requirement that before you claim that you're unemployable, that you have to at least attempt vocational rehab. These are some common sense things that would make sense, that would be super, but they're going to be blocked. It's just not going to happen. And the reason is because of this bottom bullet here. We have a term in political science called iron triangles, and there's an iron triangle between the bureaucracy and and Congress and the interest groups. So the left is afraid to touch it because they'll be branded as America haters, and the right is afraid to touch it because they enjoy being seen as pro-veteran. And in between, Congress is unlikely to deal with these really, really difficult, thorny issues. And veteran service organizations are, in most cases, engaged in a daily knife fight about how to provide services better, how to get their people the benefits they've earned and all of that. And all of that is a positive. And so they never get a chance to think in these broad normative terms about, are we providing the right things? They're just trying to provide the things they provide as much as they can. Okay, so thinking about this in broad terms is not something that most veteran service organizations have an opportunity to do. Here's the good news. There's a famous phrase in the literature that says regulations are static and behavior is dynamic. Regulations are static, behavior is dynamic. So the Congress can pass a law that says XYZ behavior is illegal, and then human behavior finds a way to work around that and to find loopholes. So I was riding down here yesterday in my car and I was listening to the radio. There's a new book out. It's an Amazon bestseller, according to Nick Morris or somebody. And it says Obamacare Survival Guide. You know how you can exploit the loopholes in Obamacare. The law isn't even implemented yet, and the human behavior ways to get out of the law are already out there. So regulations are static and behavior is dynamic. But guess what? The good news is philanthropists are dynamic too. Through careful customer analysis, careful market analysis, and careful observation of the behaviors that your giving creates, you can create positive incentives. You can go back from this idea of, well, we're just going to throw a bunch of money at the problem and hope for the best, to actually observing the kinds of behaviors that are generated in the target population, and then changing your giving according to the way that the behavior actually shakes out. So you have the benefit, unlike the federal government, of being dynamic. And so I'm going to leave you with a couple of principles, and I think we're going to do some questions. Where did my principles go? They're there. Okay. So I know that I started off by saying that paternalism is bad. Paternalism is bad when it's the government doing paternalism. Paternalism is not necessarily bad when it comes from a nonprofit. Here's what I mean. It's okay to expect certain positive returns on your investment. It's okay to expect positive behavior returns on grant investment. So consider having employment, school, volunteerism requirements for recipients of services. Secondly, identify what behavior you want to promote as an organization, whether it's entering and successfully staying in the workforce, whether it's seeking mental health treatment for mental health conditions, whatever it is. Reward desirable behaviors. Identify the behaviors that you want and reward them. So public policy, PhD in 2 sentences. If you want less of something, tax it. And if you want more of something, subsidize it. Right? Pretty obvious, but reward desirable behavior. And then be dynamic. That's this last bullet. Assess, reassess, and adapt to unintended consequences. Pay attention to the consequences and the things that are created by your giving, and then change your giving if you need to. Change your programs. Don't be afraid. Don't get hidebound in the fact that you have this huge program with all of this infrastructure. Don't be afraid to break up some of the infrastructure if the infrastructure is causing perverse incentives. Okay, that was kind of quick and dirty. I know I said some things that maybe caused some folks to want to throw things at me, but I didn't get anything thrown at me, so I'm ready to have some questions from you. Please.
I don't push back on the concepts that you laid out. I think there's one that you might add to that list, which is if the federal government is going to pay. Oh, sorry.
If the federal government's going to pay disability, then should that disability be tied to recovery? In other words, can I receive 100% service connection PTSD until age 72 and never go get help? Because under the current system, that's the way it is.
Under the current system, you can.
Yeah. So my point is,
and
so if we are going to cover the gap between an injury and then recovery, and part of that includes compensation and health care, should that person have to try to recover, and is that part of our model? Should that be expressed as part of the model?
what do you think?
Yeah, of course.
Right? Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that we would, particularly now, so nobody's faking amputations, right? It's impossible to fake amputation. We're really impossible. And post-traumatic stress is a real condition with real people whose lives have been shattered by it. So I'm not minimizing it. But it is possible to exaggerate symptoms. It's possible to behave in sick ways because you know that you're going to get better compensation if you're sick. And as a matter of fact, the labor economic model would suggest that's exactly what people are going to do. They're going to supply more of something because they're rewarded for supplying. And in this case, they're going to supply more sickness to the sort of social world because they're paid more for being sick. So with respect to PTSD, there's two major challenges. The first is we wouldn't want anybody who needs treatment, we don't want anybody who needs treatment to be denied that treatment. That would be very, very unhealthy and causes people to kill themselves and, violence in their homes and all kinds of really negative things. On the other hand, we need to balance that desire with the desire to not reward people for being sick. So I think one easy way to do that, and one thing that I would love to see in federal policy sooner rather than later, is a link between if you're receiving PTSD compensation, you should be required to attend a monthly, whatever the treatment course is for PTSD. So you go to your focus group, or you go to your monthly counseling, or whatever. Something relatively small, but it's incentivizing, or it's requiring people to actually seek the benefits that are going to make them better, in this case medical care, rather than sort of, sitting at home on their couch drinking whiskey and feeling sorry for themselves. And that's the danger, because what we don't want to do is marginalize people for both normative and positive reasons. The normative reason, because they're Americans, and doggone it, it's disgusting that they might have become disabled by military service, and we don't want to make that worse by policy. The positive reason is because we want them to be out there earning and paying taxes and taking care of their families and not feeling like victims. So absolutely, that's a case where there should be a link. Yeah, long answer to a short question, but yes. Sir?
I consider myself by nature to be positive. Good luck. Think what we just talked about in unemployment benefits, right? That third rail, the slide that you had up there. I completely agree with what you're saying and what we ought to try to do. But my God, you talk about headwinds to try to get something to make any sense. And just from a human standpoint, it's unconscionable as a country. We allow these things to go on, but they do. And the big question is going to be is, how do we fix it? How do we fix it? I don't know that anybody has that answer, and it can be pretty glum thinking about that.
That's one thing that keeps me up at night, honestly. If you draw the Venn diagram, remember what a Venn diagram is with the circles, right? If you draw the Venn diagram of people who are educated in this area and who have an interest in this area and who have the ability to stand up in front of an audience and say something like this without getting stoned, it's like me. Right? Because there aren't that many people. I feel a little bit like, I'm wearing a hair shirt here and eating locusts, but hopefully Jesus will come to be baptized soon and we'll move on. But no, so I feel like, I feel like I'm trying to be a little bit of a prophet here, and this is hard stuff. This is not easy stuff. And even getting from the normative, which I've spent the whole time in the normative, to the positive and start to actually put policies in place. I mean, if you were a dictator, you couldn't do it, much less a member of a democracy that at best is messy. Sir?
Hey, Major. Shouldn't we really emphasize the moral aspect of doing this? I mean, is that not the way out of it, to really discuss and look at all these benefits and things as really we're not doing them a service? And I think if you look at it from a moral perspective, in the end, these soldiers and airmen and whatever, they really need the incentive to get back to life and all that stuff. So by doing a lot of things that we do in our government, I think the moral case is really the only case we can make.
That's right. But going back to his point, you can also make the people who would oppose this regime of changes, or this group of changes, would also make a moral case that because you served, you are owed, you deserve everything, right? You deserve the hero treatment, you deserve all of that. And that's the moral argument that the people on that side will make without consequence to the behaviors that it creates. We see this in all kinds of behaviors. We see this in in unemployment benefits, right? We want to keep food on somebody's table, but we're going to pay them unemployment benefits for 99 weeks and pretend as if it doesn't have work disincentives. Of course it does. Every undergraduate textbook will show you that it does, but we still do that anyway. Yeah, it's tough. I recognize that I'm sort of crying from the mountaintop here.
So Dan, what interests me most and what intrigues me most is this idea of selflessness in service. And somehow miraculously at separation it turns into selfishness. Have you thought about that? Have you looked at that? I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that juxtaposition between what we look at military service as an act of extreme selflessness, and then this crossing over in what appears to be acts of selfishness for some. And I absolutely am with you on where people are deserving, this is what we need. But what about this issue?
Yeah, you're right. So the perception of military service members is this idea of selfless service, and that's something that we talk about a lot. But when we look at, when those of us who are in service and used to be in service or whatever, look at ourselves in the mirror, there's an element of, yes, we are Mother Teresa, right? We are laying down our lives for others, and we're proud of that, and that's certainly a part of our identity. But at the end of the day, the other part is that there's kind of duality that says we're also providing for our families, and we're also rational economic consumers, right? We'll cross the street we'll cross the street to save 3 cents on a gallon of gas, but then that same kind of behavior we don't expect to have ramifications in the labor force, right? Of course it does. It's not so I question the latter half of your question about whether it's selfish to seek these benefits. It's not. It's rational. What we need to do, though, is create rationality that lines up with our values and our morals and doesn't accidentally cripple veterans. So create rational incentives that people want to chase. But I wouldn't characterize chasing these benefits as selfish. I don't think it is. It's just rational.
Yes, one of the things that I think is critical as well as we talk about veterans is having an asset-based conversation around veterans. If you look at the sheer investment, I know there's a moral argument, but there's also a financial argument. Right now, a Marine infantryman, it costs $40,000 just for the initial training to put that individual through school to be an infantryman. And for an F-16 fighter pilot, it's $16 million. And so the notion, right, in my opinion, especially as a veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan, that you're coming out of the military with these skills and this knowledge, this ability to serve, and that you would literally be put on the sidelines by some of these programs or incentivized to be on the sidelines. That's the real injustice, because one of the studies that was done specifically around continued service is that 80% of these individuals, right, want to continue to serve in some way, shape, or form in their local and national communities. And so as we look at philanthropy, and this is something, I got to put a plug in, I'm with McCormick Foundation. What we're trying to do is not just have veterans be a cause of philanthropy, but also be a resource for philanthropy. You have individuals coming back who are doing nation building overseas, and if anybody in this room would agree, we definitely could use some nation building here. So, one of the major issues that I have is this, that we've been acronymed out. You say post 9/11 veteran, you say PTS, you say TBI, you say MST, but nobody's having that asset-based conversation, and honestly, I feel that that's one of the more perverse incentives for veterans, because as you define veterans based on these acronyms, veterans are very good at meeting and exceeding the standards, even if those standards aren't very high. And so, how do you feel about making sure that our conversation around veterans is based upon that these are returning assets to the community and not just returning individuals?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the guidebook actually has that as one of the guiding principles, that these folks are not broken. In some cases, they have different, in all cases, they have a different set of challenges than they did pre-service, but they also come with a huge set of additional benefits that they didn't have pre-service in terms of their skill level and their maturity and all of that stuff. And so it is immoral, I think, to, once they exit the service, to bribe them to not be in the labor force. It's disgusting, right? It's going to the Lamborghini factory and spending all this money making a Lamborghini, and then as soon as it rolls off the assembly line, You put a bunch of sugar in the gas tank. That's all we're doing. And it absolutely is immoral. And I think it's the wrong thing to do. But we've drifted into this, we've sort of found ourselves on the rocky shoals of a bad place, but we've drifted here. Nobody drove the ship here. We just somehow drifted here over the last 60 or 70 years of veterans policy. Somehow we ended up in this bad place. But the solution to it is partially on Capitol Hill, whichever direction that is from here. Partially on Capitol Hill, of course, and at the White House, but it's also it's especially in this room because you folks have the ability to respond quickly, and the federal government just doesn't. I mean, this is going to be a 30 or 40 year conversation at best.
Well, that goes to the point that it's complicated. And I mean, obviously, if we were to take, monotypes of people, because I work for an agency that helps people get access to claims, then I should be saying, oh, they should get their claims, they should get their claims. Those who have injuries and illnesses should get their claims, and Service Connection also allows them, in many of our clients, it's not necessarily the monetary benefits, because if they're under 100% service connected, it's not enough money to live on anyway. It's more about access to health care. And and while no matter how much of a go-getter you are that you need health care, you've had many, many surgeries, so that's one thing. On the other side of the coin is we do see this happening. We require our transitional housing clients to do volunteerism or go to school or have some kind of job, even if it's, depending on where they are in their life and in their health, if it's a short period of time a week or if it's full time. And we have people who definitely do want to get back and work, whether they're service connected or not. So I think it's like all things, there's a lot of muddiness in between. The other thing I want to say is, you have a young person, their identity has been changed, so the incentive not to leave the house is not just about money, it's about their isolation and their depression at sort of figuring out, what do I do now? I'm at sea. So what that means to me is you have to have more opportunities to go out, whether it's working, volunteering, just being around people, getting out of yourself. And the final thing I would say is, now here you are, what do you think is, what do you account for your, very productive nature? What's the difference between you and somebody who's not going to leave the house?
So I want to make a comment about that, and then I'm going to close with a short story, which I think will answer your question. So the comment I would make is that this is a conversation about disability benefits, not about health care. So the top three claims of disability in the VA, right, and last year, I think it's established in 2011, were hearing loss, tinnitus, which is a version of hearing loss, ringing in the ears, and post-traumatic stress, right? Two of those just require, those aren't disabilities, right? Hearing loss is not a disability. It's a condition that can be treated. Tinnitus is a condition that can be treated. And PTSD is a condition that can be treated. And those people deserve treatment for those things if they're incurred in service, clearly. Whether or not they're disabled enough to also deserve a financial payment is an open question, and I would suggest to you that the answer might be no. And that it's okay to say no to the bear. You can't have any more blueberry muffins. You've had enough, right? And as to the question of how I got better or why I got better, I want to tell you a very brief story. The 1 minute thing went up like 2 minutes ago. Too bad, I've got the mic and you don't. So I was post-injury about 2 months or so, still in a power wheelchair, very skinny, had a shattered pelvis and some open abdominal stuff going on still, and was very, very uncomfortable just sitting in the wheelchair with all the special padding, much less sitting on any hard surface was totally impossible. And my daughter at the time was about 2 and a half, almost 3. And she's playing in front of me on the floor, we were in a Fisher House, and I don't know if Fisher House Foundation is here or not, but love them, thank you. So we're sitting in a Fisher House, and she's playing on the floor with some Legos. And she turned around and said, "Daddy, can you play Legos with me?" And I said, "I'm sorry, baby, I can't," because I was, in this wheelchair. My hands were all, I couldn't move my hands. I was all sort of had paralysis in my hand. And she turned around, she said under her breath, but loud enough where I could hear, she said, "My daddy can't do anything." And I turned off the wheelchair, because it was a power one, and didn't want to hit the joystick on accident, get run over. Turned off the wheelchair, and I crawled out of the damn wheelchair, and I sat on the floor on my broken pelvis, and I played Lego with my daughter. And I think that a great majority, a great part of my attitude and my recovery and all that has been driven by the fact that I still have to be a dad, and I still have to be a husband. I have to honor, and I believe I have to honor God with the rest of my life, as I did in the first part. And so all of that,